Now we're on. Awesome. There we go. I think centered well enough. Get started. I think we're loud enough, maybe. All right. So we're just going to do the 7th book today, I think. It's a long one. About 50 pages. It's a biggie. That's what everyone knows. All right. The 7th book, 52 BC, AUC 702. Sole Consul Pompey. Vercingetorix and the Great Revolt. 1. Now Gaul was pacified. Caesar set out for Italy to hold assizes as arranged. There he learned of the murder of Publius Clodius. When he heard news of the Senate's decree that all men of an age to do military service must take the oath, he decided to hold a levy throughout his province. News of this was quickly brought to Transalpine Gaul. The Gauls exaggerated the reports and embellished them with rumors, as the occasion seemed to require. Caesar, they said, was being detained because of a revolt at Rome, and was unable to join his army because of the serious unrest. Those who had previously lamented their subjection to the rule of the Roman people now had an opportunity to begin planning a strategy of war more freely and with greater daring. The Gallic leaders called an assembly in a remote forest location. There they deplored the execution of Acco and declared that the same fate could befall them. They bemoaned Gaul's collective lot and offered all kinds of pledges and prizes in the search for people prepared to start a war and risk their own lives to set Gaul free. First of all, they said a strategy for cutting Caesar off from his army was essential before their secret negotiations were revealed. This would be simple, because the legions would not dare to leave winter quarters without their commander, and the commander would not be able to reach his legions without an armed escort. Finally, they agreed it was preferable to die in battle rather than fail to recover their former military reputation and the freedom which they had inherited from their ancestors. 2. Following this debate, the Carnutes declared that there was no risk they would not undergo for the good of all, and they promised to take their overall lead in initiating hostilities. For the time being, the Gauls could not use hostages to provide guarantees between themselves, for fear their plan should leak out, so they sought to solemnize it with an oath and pledge, putting their military standards together, a rite of the greatest sanctity. This was to ensure that they would not be deserted by the rest after the war had been started. The Carnutes were warmly congratulated. The oath was taken by all who were present. The timing of their action was decided, and the meeting broke up. 3. When the day came and the signal was given, the Carnutes charged on Cenabum, led by 2 reckless characters called Coruatas and Conconnectadumnus. They slaughtered the Roman citizens who had settled there for business purposes, among them one Gaius Fufius Sida, a respectable Roman knight who presided over the corn supply on Caesar's orders, and plundered their property. News of this spread rapidly to all the Gallic states. Wherever an event of particular note or significance takes place, the Gauls shout it abroad in the countryside and the villages. Others then take up the cry and pass it on to their neighbors. So it happened on this occasion. For what had taken place at dawn in Cenabum was made known before the end of the first watch in Arvernian territory, which is about 160 miles away. 4. There an Arvernian called Vercingetorix acted in similar fashion. He was the son of Celtillus, and his father had won dominion over the whole of Gaul. For this reason, namely trying to gain a kingdom, Celtillus had been put to death by the state. Vercingetorix was a young man whose abilities were second to none. He summoned his dependents and easily roused them. Once his plan became known, there was a general rush to arms. His uncle Brutio and the other leading men who opposed taking such a risk tried to restrain him and banished him from the town of Gergovia. Still he persisted and held a levy of down and outs and desperadoes in the open countryside instead. After he had mustered this gang, every Avernian whom Vercingetorix approached was won over to his own point of view. He urged them to take up arms in order to win liberty for all. Once he had assembled a large force, he exiled the opponents who so recently had themselves expelled him. Vercingetorix was now proclaimed king by his supporters. He sent out embassies in all directions, asking everyone to remain loyal, and soon formed alliances with Senones, the Parisi, the Pictones, the Cadurici, the Turoni, the Alarici, the Lemophyses, and the Andes, and all the other Gallic peoples along the coast. The supreme command was conferred on him with unanimous approval. After winning this position of command, he demanded hostages from all these people and ordered them to send him a specified number of soldiers at once. He decreed that each state must produce a given number of weapons before a certain date and paid particular attention to the cavalry. In his command, he combined extreme conscientiousness with extreme severity. He used harsh punishments to bring waverers into line. For the more serious offenses, death was inflicted by burning and all kinds of torture, while for lesser faults the offender's ears were cut off or one of his eyes gouged out. He was then sent home as an example to others, to strike fear into them by severity of the punishment. 5. By such penalties as these, Vercingetorix quickly gathered an army. He sent a Caturican called Lucitarius, a man of great daring, to the Ruteni, with part of his force. He himself headed for the Bituriges. On his arrival, the Bituriges sent envoys to the Aedui, who were their protectors, to request assistance, the better to resist the enemy force. On the advice of the legates Caesar had left with his army, the Aedui then sent a force of cavalry and infantry to the assistance of the Bituriges. These forces reached the Loire, the river which separates the Bituriges from the Aedui, and lingered there for several days, not daring to cross. They then returned home and told the Roman legates that they had turned back for fear of treachery on the part of the Bituriges. They had discovered, they said, that the Bituriges had planned to surround them on one side and the Averni on the other if they crossed the river. As to whether they withdrew for this reason, which they gave to the legates, or from motives of treachery, it does not seem appropriate to make a definite pronouncement, since we do not know for certain. Immediately after the departure of the Aedui, the Bituriges joined forces with the Averni. 6. In Italy, Caesar received news of these events. Once he understood that affairs at Rome were now in a more favorable position, thanks to the resolution of Pompey, he set out for Transalpine Gaul. On his arrival, he was faced with a considerable problem. By what strategy was he to reach his army? For he realized that if he summoned the legions to the province, they would have to engage in battle while on the march, and in his absence. But if he made his way to the army, he perceived that he could not, with any degree of safety, entrust his life even to the Gauls, who at the time seemed to be peaceable. 7. Meantime, Lucitarius the Caturican, who had been sent to the Ruteni, won the people over to the side of the Averni. He moved on to the Nitiobriges and the Gabali. He received hostages from both. Once he had mustered a large force, he made his way into the province towards Narbo to launch an assault. On receiving news of this, Caesar decided that setting out for Narbo must take priority over all his other plans. When he arrived there, he reassured the frightened inhabitants and stationed troop outposts among the Ruteni who lived in the province, and also among the Volcae Aracomici, the Tolosates around Narbo. These were the areas closest to the enemy. He also ordered a detachment of his forces from the province and the fresh reinforcements which he had brought from Italy to assemble in Helvian territory, which adjoins that of the Averni. 8. Lucitarius was checked and forced to retire because of these preparations, as he considered it risky to venture within the outposts. Caesar set out for Helvian territory. The Cervenes Mountains, which separate the Arverni from the Helvi, made the march difficult because of the very deep snow there in winter. Even so, with great exertion, the soldiers cleared away the snow to a depth of 6 feet and opened up a way. Then Caesar made his way through into the territory of the Arverni. They were caught off guard and unawares, for they thought that the Cervenes protected them like a wall, and at that time of year the paths had never been passable before, not even for individual travelers. Caesar ordered his cavalry to range as widely as possible, striking as much fear as it could into the enemy. Rumors and reports of this quickly reached Vercingetorix. The Arverni all surrounded him in a panic, begging him to consider their plight and not to let them be plundered by their foes, especially now the focus of hostilities had clearly shifted onto themselves. He was swayed by their entreaties and transferred his camp from the Bituriges back to the Arvenian territory. 9. Even so, Caesar had remained in this area for 2 days, as he had anticipated that Vercingetorix's plans would turn out in this way. He then departed from his army on the pretext of assembling reinforcements and cavalry, and left the young Brutus in command of the forces, instructing him to let the cavalry range as widely as possible in all directions. He would do his best not to be absent for more than 3 days. After all this was arranged, to the surprise of his own men, he made his way with all possible speed to Vienna. There he picked up a fresh force of cavalry, which he had sent on there some time before, and without breaking the march by day or night, made his way through Aeduan territory into that of Lingones, where 2 of his legions were wintering. His purpose in moving with such speed was to forestall the possibility of a plot by the Aedui, perhaps even a plot against his life. After arriving, he sent word to the rest of the legions, and had them all assembled in one place before the news of his presence could reach the Arverni. On learning of his arrival, Vercingetorix brought his army back to the territory of the Bituriges. From there he set out against Gorgobina, a town of the Boii, and began to attack it. Caesar had settled the Boii there after defeating them in campaign against the Helvetii, and had put them under Aeduan jurisdiction. 10. This move presented Caesar with a considerable tactical problem. If he detained the legions in a single place for the rest of the winter, then he feared that once a people subject to the Aedui had been defeated, the whole of Gaul would desert him, in view of the fact that he had no protection to offer to his friends. On the other hand, he was afraid that if he took his men out of winter quarters too early, they would then have difficulties over supplies because of problems with transportation. Yet it seemed preferable to endure any hardship rather than accept such indignity and lose the goodwill of his supporters. So he encouraged the Aedui to transport supplies and sent messengers on ahead to the Boii to tell them he was on his way, and urged them to remain loyal and resist the enemy's attack with courage. Leaving 2 of the legions at Aegidincum with the heavy baggage of the whole army, he set out for the territory of the Boii. 11. He reached Velonodunum, a town of the Senones, on the following day. To ensure no enemy was left in the rear, and to facilitate the transport of supplies, he laid siege to this town, and within 2 days had surrounded it with siege works. On the 3rd day, envoys were sent from the town to ask for terms of surrender. He ordered them to collect up their weapons, bring out their horses, and produce 600 hostages. He left his legate Gaius Trebonius to complete these arrangements. He himself set out for Cenobum, a town of the Carnutes, so as to complete his march as quickly as possible. News of the siege of Velonodunum had only just reached the Carnutes, who were expecting it to be rather a long drawn-out affair, and were amassing a force to send to the defense of Cenobum. Within 2 days, Caesar arrived. He encamped in front of the town, but the lateness of the hour was against him, and he put off the assault until the following day. He commanded his soldiers to prepare what was needed for the attack, as he was afraid that the people would escape from the town by night, for Cinnabon was situated beside the bridge over the river Loire. He ordered 2 legions to keep watch under arms. Just before midnight, the people of Cinnabon moved quietly out of the town and began to cross the river. When this was reported to him by the patrols, Caesar set fire to the gates, sent in the 2 legions which he had ordered to stand ready, and took possession of the town. He captured all but a very few of the enemy, because the narrowness of the bridge and the streets cut off the escape of the main body of citizens. He plundered the town and burnt it, gave booty to his soldiers, led his army over the Loire, and made his way to the land of the Bituriges. Hey, Liz. It's looking pretty good. Still a bit fuzzy. "12. When Vercingetorix learned of Caesar's arrival, he raised the siege of Gorgobina and set out to meet him. Caesar had begun to besiege Noviodunum, a town of the Bituriges, which lay on his route. Envoys came to him from the town to beg him to pardon them and spare their lives. So in order to bring matters to a conclusion with characteristic speed, he ordered them to collect their weapons, bring out their horses, and produce hostages. Some of these hostages had already been surrendered, and the remaining tasks were being sorted out, while centurions and a few soldiers had been sent into the town to hunt out the weapons and horses. At the moment, the enemy cavalry, which had gone on ahead of Vercingetorix's column, was spied in the distance. The moment the townspeople caught sight of it, they began to hope for relief. Raising a shout, they started to take up weapons, close the gates, and man the wall. The centurions inside the town realized from the way the Gauls were behaving that they were devising some new plans of action, so they drew their swords, seized the gates, and got all their men out safely. Herpaderp. 13. Caesar ordered his cavalry to be led out of camp and engage the enemy in battle. When his own cavalrymen got into difficulties, he sent to their assistance about 400 German horsemen. From the beginning, he had arranged to keep these men with him. The Gauls could not withstand their attack. They were put to flight and withdrew to the main army, with heavy casualties. After their defeat, the townspeople were in a panic once more. They seized the men they believed to be responsible for inciting the citizens, led them off to Caesar, and surrendered themselves to him. Now that these events had been brought to a successful conclusion, Caesar set off for Avaricum. This was a very large and well-fortified town in the land of the Bituriges, and in a particularly fertile area of the territory. Once this town was won, he was sure that the nation of the Bituriges would give itself up to his control. Vercingetorix had suffered one setback after another at Valadunum, at Cinnabon, and at Noviodunum. He summoned his supporters to an assembly and told them of the need to continue the war according to a totally different strategy from the one they had adopted until now. They must not now concentrate their efforts on cutting the Romans off from food and supplies by every means possible. This would be easy, Vercingetorix claimed, because they themselves had a large force of cavalry, and also because the time of year was in their favor. The Romans could not cut forage for themselves, and would inevitably have to separate and go in search of food from buildings, and every day the Gallic cavalry could pick them off. Moreover, he went on, private interests must be sacrificed to the safety of all. They must burn down their buildings and settlements, which seemed likely to be within reach of the foraging parties on either side of their route. They would then themselves have sufficient store of the necessary supplies, because they would receive material support from the Gallic peoples, in whose territories the war was going on. The Romans, on the other hand, would either be unable to endure such hardship, or at great risk would advance considerable distances from their camp. It was of small importance whether they killed the Romans or merely seized the baggage, without which they could not continue the fight. In addition, he said they must burn any towns which were not protected from all danger by their fortifications and position. Thus there would be no refuge for Gauls to avoid taking part in the campaign, and also no chances for the Romans to carry off plenty of supplies and booty. If these proposals seemed harsh and severe, he concluded, they must remember that it was far worse to have their children and wives dragged off into slavery and themselves be killed, and this was sure to be their fate if they were defeated. 15. Vercingetorix's proposal received unanimous support. In a single day, more than 20 cities of the Bituriges were set on fire. The same policy was carried out in the other states. Fires were visible in every direction. The Gauls were all deeply distressed at this action, but even so they put forward as their consolation the certainty that now victory was virtually assured. They would quickly recover all that they had previously lost. At a general assembly, they debated whether Avaricum should be burned or defended. The Bituriges fell at the feet of all the Gauls, pleading not to be compelled to burn down with their own hands what was nearly the finest city in the whole of Gaul, a city, moreover, which both protected and adorned their nation. They claimed that its site made it easy for them to defend, for it was almost completely surrounded by a river and marsh. There was only one entranceway, and an extremely narrow one at that. Their plea was granted. Vercingetorix opposed it at first, but later he gave it to the appeals of his own men, out of pity for the people. Suitable defenders for the town were then selected. 16. Vercingetorix followed Caesar by short marches, and chose a place for his camp which was protected by marshes and woods about 15 miles from Avaricum. There, reliable scouts kept him hourly informed of what was going on at Avaricum, and he issued orders for what he wanted done. He kept watch on all our foraging and corn-gathering expeditions. When our men were obliged to scatter and range, farther afield he attacked them and inflicted serious harm. Our men countered this as far as they were able by means of forward planning, going out in different directions and not at fixed times. 17. Caesar pitched his camp on the side of the town which, as we mentioned above, had a narrow entrance left open by the river and the marshes. There he began to prepare an earthwork, move up siege shelters, and construct 2 towers, for the geography of the site made it impossible for him to encircle it with siege works. He continued to press the boy and the Agii about the supply of corn. The Agii were little help, for they carried out his request without enthusiasm. The boy had few resources, for their state was poor and ineffectual, and they soon consumed whatever they did have. So the army suffered extreme difficulties over the corn supply because of the ineffectiveness of the boy and the negligence of the Agii, and because of the burning of buildings to such an extent that for several days the soldiers went without corn altogether, and warded off the worst of their hunger by driving cattle in from faraway villages. Even so, not one of them was heard to utter a word which would disgrace the sovereignty of the Roman people and its previous victories. Indeed, when Caesar spoke to each of the legions while they were busy with the works, and said that he would put an end to the siege if they were finding the scarcity of food too hard to endure, every one of them begged him not to do so. For a number of years, they said, they had served under his command without incurring any dishonor, or abandoning any action once they had undertaken it. They would consider it disgraceful now to leave the siege they had begun. They would rather endure every hardship than fail to avenge the Roman citizens who had perished at Cenabum because of the Gallic treachery. This was the decision they entrusted to the centurions and military tribunes, so that they could report it to Caesar. Excuse me. The towers were already coming close to the wall when Caesar learned from prisoners that Vercingetorix had run out of food supplies and moved his camp nearer to Avaricum. Also that Vercingetorix himself intended to take his cavalry and the light armed troops which usually fought among them and set a trap, and that he had set out for the place where he expected our men to go the next day in search of forage. After receiving this news, Caesar silently set out at midnight, and in the morning reached the enemy camp. The Gauls had soon learned from scouts of Caesar's coming. They hid their wagons and heavy baggage in the depths of the woods, and drew up their entire force in a high open place. When news of this came, Caesar gave orders for the men to pile up their packs and get their weapons ready. 19. The Gauls were established on this hill, which sloped gently upward from its base, and was almost entirely surrounded by a marsh, no more than 50 feet wide, but virtually impenetrable. After breaking up their causeways, therefore, they had complete confidence in the security of their position. Separated into divisions, according to their nationalities, they had control of all the fords and passes over the marsh. If the Romans tried to break across the marsh, the Gauls were determined to attack them from their advantageous position while they were stuck fast. As a result, an observer looking at how close the Gauls were would think they were ready to fight under almost equal battle conditions, but anyone who perceived that the relative positions of the two armies were unequal would realize that the Gauls were only making an empty pretense of readiness to engage. The Roman soldiers were furious that the enemy was able to endure the sight of them and stand firm, especially at so short a distance, and they clamored for the signal to engage. But Caesar explained that victory would inevitably cost them dear in terms of losses and the deaths of many brave men. Moreover, when he saw they were so ready to take any risk to win him honor, he would himself deserve utter condemnation if he did not treat their lives as more valuable than his own safety. That same day, after comforting the soldiers in this manner, he led them back to camp and organized everything else necessary for the siege of Avaricum. 20. On returning to his supporters, Vercingetorix was accused of treachery for shifting his camp nearer to the Romans, for setting off with the entire cavalry, leaving a large force without its commander, and because after his departure the Romans had seized their opportunity and arrived so soon. It was impossible, said his accusers, for all this to have taken place by chance and not deliberate design. He preferred to become king of Gaul with Caesar's permission rather than through their support. This was the substance of the charges against him, but Vercingetorix replied to the charges by pointing out that as far as moving camp was concerned, he had taken this step because of the shortage of food, and had even done so with their approval. As for coming too close to the Romans, he had been influenced in his decision by the advantage offered by the site in question. For the protection it provided meant that it practically defended itself. Furthermore, there could have been no need of the cavalry's services in marshland, whereas they had proved useful in the places where they had been sent. It was by deliberate policy that he had not entrusted the supreme command to another man on his departure, to prevent popular pressure forcing anyone into fighting. And he could see that they were all lacking in resolution and wanted to engage only because they could no longer bear the degree of hardship. If it was by chance that the Romans had arrived on the scene, he went on, then they had fortune to thank. While if the Romans had been summoned because someone had leaked information to them, they ought themselves to thank the traitor for enabling them from their advantageous position to find out how few the Romans were, and to despise them as cowards for not daring to engage and instead withdrawing back to camp. He had no desire to win a position of command from Caesar through some act of treachery. Such a position was within his grasp in any case, thanks to the victory of which he and all Gaul were already assured. Yes, and he would even give them back his command if they believed they were conferring a distinction upon him greater than the security which they received from him in return. So that you understand, I am speaking the whole truth concerning these matters, said Vercingetorix. Listen to these Roman soldiers here. He brought forward some slaves captured while foraging a few days previously. They had been tortured, imprisoned, and starved. They had already been drilled in what to say when they were interrogated, and declared that they were legionary soldiers who had been driven by hunger and lack of provisions to escape the camp in secret and search for whatever corn or cattle they could find in the countryside. The whole army, they claimed, was in similar want, and no one had strength enough to endure any strenuous effort. So their commander had decided that if his army had made no progress with the siege within 3 days, he would withdraw it. "There are the services I have rendered you," said Vercingetorix, "though you accuse me of betraying you. Even though your own blood has not been shed, you see before you a mighty and victorious army reduced to starvation, and I have ensured that no Gallic state will receive the Roman army within its borders when it seeks refuge in ignominious flight." 21. The whole host shouted aloud and clashed their weapons together, as is their custom when indicating agreement with someone's proposal. They declared Vercingetorix the finest of leaders. There could be no doubt of his fidelity, and no better strategy for the campaign. They resolved to send to the town 10,000 picked men from the whole force, and decided that the safety of all was not to be entrusted to the Bituriges alone. This was because they were aware that the Bituriges would win all the credit for victory if they held the town. 22. The Gauls used every kind of ingenuity to counter the extraordinary bravery of our soldiers. They are an extremely resourceful people, and particularly talented at copying and putting into practice anything they are taught. Now, for example, they began using nooses to turn our grappling hooks aside. Once these were made secure, they used ropes to drag them inside the walls. They also started tunneling beneath our earthworks to undermine it. This was all the more skillfully done because they have many iron mines, and so are practiced experts in every kind of tunneling. They had covered every section of their wall with towers and overlaid these with hides. Now they made frequent sorties by day and night, trying to set fire to the earthwork or attack our soldiers while they were working on the siege. They tried to match the height of our towers, which increased daily as the earthwork was raised higher and higher, by extending the scaffolding on their own towers. They sabotaged the progress of the mines, which we had driven by the use of timbers, tempered and sharpened at the end, boiling pitch and heavy rocks. In this way, they prevented us from coming close to the walls of the town. 23. All Gallic walls follow virtually the same pattern. At right angles to the wall along its entire length, beams are placed in the ground at equal intervals, 2 feet apart. These are secured firmly from the inside and then covered with large amounts of rubble. The gaps we mentioned between them are filled in with large rocks at the front. Once the beams are laid and joined, another level is added on top. The length of the gaps remains the same, but the second set of beams does not touch the first. Rather, because the spaces in between the beams are the same, each one is firmly kept separate by single stones. The whole construction is built in this manner until the wall reaches the appropriate height. The finished edifice is not unattractive, with the variations in its appearance and the alternating beams and rocks in straight lines, following the line of their own level. Moreover, it offers an excellent means for practical defense of cities. The stones give protection from fire and the timber from battering rams, for it's impossible to break through continuous beams, usually 40 feet long, and secure it on the inside, or to tear them apart. 24. All these factors hindered the siege operations. Despite continually being obstructed by the cold and constant rain, by unremitting effort of our soldiers still overcame every obstacle. Within 25 days they had built an earthworks 330 feet wide and 80 feet high, which almost touched the enemy wall. As was his custom, Caesar stayed by the works, on the alert, and urged the soldiers not to cease their efforts for so much as a moment. Shortly before the third watch, smoke was observed coming from the earthworks, for the enemy had tunneled underneath it and set fire to it from below. At that moment a shout went up along the wall, and the enemy made a sortie from the 2 gates beside our own towers. At long range, some of the enemy began to throw torches and tinder from the wall onto the earthwork. They poured down pitch and other inflammable material, so that it was almost impossible to make a calculated decision about which point the men should head for first or where they should bring help. Even so, it was Caesar's regular practice to keep 2 legions on watch in front of the camp, and there were more available because they were working on the earthwork in shifts. So it was soon settled that some of our men countered the sorties, while others withdrew the towers and broke up a section of the earthwork. A whole crowd rushed out of the camp to put out the fire. "25. The night was now at an end, yet fighting continued everywhere, and the enemy's hopes of victory were continually being renewed, especially since they could see the wooden screens of our towers being burned down and observe how difficult it was for our men to move forward and support while thus exposed. On their side, a constant supply of fresh troops replaced those who were exhausted. They believed that at that very moment the salvation of Gaul hung in the balance, and there then occurred, before our very eyes, something which seemed to us worth recording, which we believe should not be passed over. A Gaul stood before the town gate, opposite our tower, and was throwing lumps of tallow and pitch, which were passed from hand to hand, into the fire. He was wounded in the right side by a dart from an artillery machine, breathed his last, and fell. One of the Gauls nearby stepped across the man as he lay there, and carried on with the same task. When he was killed in similar manner by a dart, a third man took over, and likewise a fourth succeeded him. Nor was that position abandoned by their defenders before the fire on the earthwork was put out, the enemy driven off on every side, and the fighting at an end." 26. The Gauls had tried everything, and everything had failed. The next day they took the decision to flee from Avaricum, at Vercingetorix's prompting and instructions. They hoped that by making the attempt in the silence of the night, they would bring it off without serious casualties on their own side, especially because Vercingetorix's camp was not far from the town, while a long stretch of marsh in between would hinder the Romans' pursuit. They were making ready for this nocturnal escape when suddenly the married women rushed out and threw themselves weeping at the feet of their men. They begged and pleaded with the men not to abandon them and the children they had together to the enemy's torments, just because their natural physical weakness made it impossible for them to join the flight. When they realized that the men were sticking to their plan, for in general, at times of extreme danger, panic allows no place for pity, these women began to cry out and alert the Romans to their flight. The Gauls were so stricken with fear of the Roman cavalry overtaking them on the road that they abandoned their plan. 27. The following day, one of the towers was brought forward, and the siege works which Caesar had set up were put in order. A fierce rainstorm blew up, and he thought that this would be a good moment to put his plan into action, for he could see that the sentries stationed on the wall were somewhat carelessly posted. So he ordered his men to be more negligent about carrying out their duties, and explained what he wanted done. The legions concealed behind shelters were outside the camp and ready for action. Caesar urged them all at long last to reap the fruits of victory, in return for their great efforts, promised rewards to the first men over the wall, and gave his soldiers the signal. They rushed out from every side and quickly occupied the wall. 28. This unexpected action panicked the enemy. They were forced down from their wall and towers and made a stand in close formation in the marketplace and open spaces, intending to form a battle line and fight to the death if they met obstruction from any quarter. When they saw that no one was coming down to level ground, but the men were pouring all round the wall, they were afraid of losing their chance to escape altogether. So they threw their weapons away, and with concerted effort made for the furthest reaches of the town. There some of them found themselves crushed in the narrow opening of the gates, and were killed by our soldiers. Others got through the gates and were killed by the cavalry. Not one of our men gave a thought to booty. They were so severely provoked by the massacre at Cinnabum and the effort they had put into the siege that they spared neither the elderly, nor the women, nor even the little children. In the end, of a total number of about 40,000, barely 800 reached Vercingetorix safely. These had run from the town as soon as they heard the shout. Vercingetorix was afraid that their arrival might evoke the pity of the ordinary Gauls and so lead to a riot in the camp. In silence, therefore, and at dead of night, he intercepted their flight. He posted his close friends and the leaders of the peoples at a distance down the road, and took measures to have the survivors split up and taken to their own peoples in the parts of the camp allotted to each from the start. 29. The next day he summoned an assembly, spoke words of comfort, and urged them not to be too downhearted or anxious over this setback. After all, he said, the Romans had not won because of their bravery or in open battle, but rather by means of trickery and siegecraft, in which they themselves were inexperienced. Anyone who expected all outcomes in time of war to be favorable was mistaken. He himself had never wanted a defense of Avaricum, and they were witnesses to the fact. This setback they had just received had come about because of the folly of the Bituriges, which everyone else had indulged too far. Even so, he continued, he would swiftly repair the damage with some more significant advances. By strenuous efforts on his part, he would bring in the peoples who were presently at odds with the rest of Gaul and establish a single strategy for the whole of Gaul. Such unity of purpose even the entire world could not withstand, and already he had all but achieved it. Meanwhile, he was only right that he should ask them, for everyone's safety, to fortify the camp so that they could more easily withstand a sudden enemy attack. 30. This speech found favor with the Gauls, above all because the setback he had suffered had not made Vercingetorix downhearted, or caused him to go into hiding and keep out of everyone's sight. In addition, they thought he showed foresight and perspicacity, since he had advised first the burning, then the abandonment of Avaricum, even before anything had gone wrong. The result was that, although defeat diminishes the authority of other commanders, the prestige of Vercingetorix, by contrast, grew daily because of the setback he had suffered. At the same time, they began to be hopeful, because of his assurance about making an alliance with the remaining peoples. Then for the first time the Gauls began to fortify their camp. Though unaccustomed to hard work, they were yet so alarmed as to believe they had to put up with whatever he ordered them to do. Excuse me. 31. Vercingetorix was as good as his word. He spared no pains to try and win the remaining people to his side, enticing them with gifts and promises. For this purpose he selected men who were most appropriate, by reason of their skills in speaking or their existing friendships, to be effective in winning them over. He had the men who escaped the storming of Avaricum armed and equipped. At the same time he made up the strength of his diminished force by demanding from the states a set number of soldiers, stating the required number and the day by which they were to arrive in camp. Also he gave orders for all archers, for Gaul has an enormous number of these, to be mustered and sent to him. By this means he quickly made up the numbers lost at Avaricum. In the meantime there came to him a certain Tudomatus. He was the son of Olavico, the king of Neobrigus, whom our senate had pronounced a friend, and had brought a large cavalry force of his own, plus some mercenary horsemen hired in Aquitania. 32. Caesar lingered several days in Avaricum. There he obtained an abundant supply of corn and other necessities, and gave the army a chance to recover from the exertions and shortages it had suffered. Winter was almost over, and the very season demanded that he restart campaigning, so he decided to set out in pursuit of the enemy and see whether he could entice them from the marshes and forest or blockade them. At that moment the leaders of the Aedui came to him as envoys to beg him to help their people in a time of dire necessity. They explained that affairs were in a perilous state, although it was their long-established custom to appoint only one magistrate each year to hold regal power. 2 men were now holding office, and both of them claimed that they had been legally appointed. One of the 2 was Convicto Ludovus, an energetic and distinguished young man. The other was Codus, a man of aristocratic birth with considerable influence and powerful connections. The brother of the latter, one Valetiacus, had held the supreme magistracy in the previous year. The entire nation was up in arms. The Senate was split, and so were the people. and each party had its dependent supporters. If the wrangling went on any longer, the two halves of the state would come to blows. They were relying, concluded the envoys, on Caesar's concern and influence to prevent this happening. 33. Despite believing that it would be to his disadvantage to move away from the war and the enemy, Caesar was well aware that disputes of this kind often led to serious setbacks. He was unwilling that a nation of substance, and one closely allied to the Roman people, which he had always fostered and honored by every possible means, should be reduced to armed violence, and wanted to prevent the side with least confidence in its own strength asking Vercingetorix for reinforcements. He considered it crucial to avert such a turn of affairs. According to the laws of the Aedui, the supreme magistrate was not permitted to set foot outside Aeduan territory. To avoid appearing to violate their rules and laws in any way, Caesar decided to march to their land in person. He summoned the entire Senate and the two men on whom the dispute centered to meet him in Dacia. Almost the entire people gathered there. Caesar was informed that a small number of men had been summoned to meet in secret at a place and time not sanctioned by law. One brother had declared the other elected. Although the law did not permit two men from a single family even to belong to the Senate, never mind being appointed as magistrates during their joint lifetime. So Caesar forced Cotus to give up office. He gave orders that Convictolitavis, who had been appointed by the priests, according to state custom when the succession of office has been broken, should hold power. 34. This decree settled the dispute. Caesar urged the Aedui to forget their disputes and differences. Once all such matters were set aside, they could devote themselves to the campaign and look forward to receiving the rewards which they would earn from him once the conquest of Gaul was complete. He also told them to send all their cavalry and 10,000 infantry to him quickly, so that he could distribute them as protection for the corn supply. Then he divided his army in two and gave 4 legions to Labienus to lead against the Senones and the Parisii, while he himself took 6 legions along the river Allier towards the town of Gergovia against the Arverni. He shared the cavalry out between them. On hearing of the move, Vercingetorix broke up all the bridges on the Allier and began to march along the opposite bank of the river. 35. The two armies moved away from each other, pitching camp within sight of one another and almost exactly opposite. Vercingetorix posted scouts to stop the Romans building a bridge at any point and moving their force across. Caesar was in a very difficult situation, in danger of having his advance blocked by the river for most of the summer, for the Allier cannot usually be forded before the autumn. To circumvent this potential problem, he pitched camp in a wooded location facing one of the bridges which Vercingetorix had torn down. The following day he remained there in hiding with the 2 legions and sent the rest of the army on ahead with all the baggage as usual. Some of the cohorts spread out to make it look as if the number of legions remained the same. He ordered this force to advance as far as possible, and when he reckoned that according to the time of day they must all be in camp, he began to rebuild the bridge using the existing piles, for the lower part of these remained intact. The work was soon complete. He took the legions across and chose a suitable place to camp, then called the rest of the army back to him. When Vercingetorix discovered this, he moved on ahead by forced marches so as to avoid being compelled to engage against his will. 36. It took 5 days' march for Caesar to reach Gergovia from this position, and on the 5th day a minor cavalry engagement took place. He reconnoitered the city's position. It was located on a high plateau, and every access route presented problems, so that he had no hope of taking it by storm. Nor did he think it advisable to undertake a siege before the corn supply was secured. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix, who was camped nearby, had disposed the forces of each individual Gallic state around him at moderate intervals. By seizing control of all the high points on the ridge, which gave a view on to the town, they presented an intimidating appearance. Each day at dawn he would order the leaders of the states which he had chosen to assist him in planning the campaign to meet with him, so it would be apparent if there was anything to report or arrange. He let scarcely a day go by without testing his men's courage and morale in an engagement of cavalry and archers mingled together. Opposite the town there was a hill, at the foot of the plateau, strongly fortified and sheer on every side. If our men could take and hold this, it appeared that they would be able to cut off the enemy's main water supply and prevent them from foraging freely. But the hill was in the control of an enemy garrison, albeit not a particularly strong one. In the dead of night, Caesar moved out of camp and expelled the garrison before it could receive reinforcements from the town. After seizing control of the site, he posted 2 legions there. He had a double trench dug 12 feet wide from the main camp to the smaller one, so that even individuals could go to and fro in safety from a sudden enemy attack. 37. All this was going on at Gergovia. The adjutant Convictolitavis, in whose favor, as we had explained, Caesar awarded a magistracy, was bribed by the Arverni. He then opened negotiations with a number of youths, chief among whom was Litaviccus, and his brothers, young men of distinguished family. He shared his bribe money with them, and encouraged them to remember they were born free, born to command. The Agii, said Convictolitavis, were the only people standing between Gaul and certain victory. The other Gallic peoples were only restrained by the example of loyalty set by the Agii, and if they abandoned it, the Romans would have no position to maintain in Gaul. It was true that Caesar had bestowed some degree of favor on him, but after all he had done no more than maintain what was obviously just claim. Why should it be the Agii who must come to Caesar as arbiter over their rules and laws, rather than the Romans to the Agii? Convictolitavis, soon won over by the young men, both with his speech and with his bribe, they declared that they would be the very first to support his strategy, and began to look for a way putting it into practice. For they were not certain that their people could be induced to start a war on impulse. They decided to send Litaviccus at the head of 10,000 men being sent to Caesar for his campaign, while his brothers went on ahead to Caesar. They also decided a strategy for dealing with all the contingencies. Today. 38. Litaviccus took over the army. When he was about 27 miles from Gergovia, he suddenly called his soldiers together and in tears said, "Where are we going, soldiers? All our cavalry, all our aristocracy are dead. 2 of our leading men, Eporedorix and Viridomarus, have been executed without trial by the Romans on a charge of treachery. Hear about it for yourselves from men who fled from the actual slaughter. My brothers and all my kinsmen are dead, and grief prevents me from speaking of what has happened." He had instructed some men in what he wanted them to say. They were now brought forward and explained the same facts as Litaviccus had declared to the assembled company already, namely that the adjutant cavalry had been killed because it was alleged that they had negotiated with the Arverni. They had themselves hidden among the throng of troops and fled from the midst of the slaughter. The Agii all cried out and begged Litaviccus to decide what they should do. As if the matter were open to debate indeed, he said, and it were not absolutely imperative that we make for Gergovia and form an alliance with the Arverni. Can we doubt that after committing this horrible crime the Romans are already hurrying here to kill us? So if we have any courage at all, let us avenge the deaths of those who have been so shamefully murdered, and put these brigands to death. Then Litaviccus pointed out the Roman citizens who were traveling with him, relying on his protection. He stole a large quantity of corn and supplies from them, tortured them cruelly, and had them executed. He sent messengers to all the Agii to rouse them with the same lies about a slaughter of cavalry and leading men, and he urged them to avenge their wrongs in the same way as he himself had done. 39. The adjutant Eporedorix was a young man of aristocratic birth and considerable influence at home. With him was Viridomarus, who was the same age and equally popular, but of lesser birth. For Divicius had recommended him to Caesar, and Caesar had raised him from humble status to the highest rank. These two had come along with the cavalry at Caesar's specific request. There was a dispute going on between them about the leadership, and in the earlier conflict over the supreme magistracy, both had fought with all their might, one on Convictolitavis's side, the other on that of Cotys. Of the two, Epidaurus reported the matter to Caesar at about midnight as soon as he heard of Litaficus's plan. He begged Caesar not to let the Aedui defect from their friendship with the Roman people because of the young men's misguided scheme, for this would be the outcome if so many thousands of men joined up with the enemy, since their kinsmen could not be indifferent to their safety, while the Aeduan people as a whole could not treat it lightly either. 40. This news caused Caesar much anxiety, for he had always shown particular favor to the Aeduan people. Without an instant's hesitation, he led 4 legions, ready for action, and all his cavalry out of camp. At such a moment, when the whole outcome seemed to depend on haste, there was no time to make the camp smaller. He left his legate Gaius Fabius in command of the camp, with 2 legions. When he gave orders for the arrest of Litaficus's brothers, he discovered that they had fled to the enemy shortly before. Caesar advised his men not to be discouraged at such a critical time by the labor of a march, and such was their eagerness that he advanced 23 miles. When he caught sight of the Aeduan column, he sent in his cavalry to delay and impede their march, forbidding them to kill anyone. Then he ordered Epidaurus and Viridormus, who Litaficus's men thought had been put to death, to mingle with the horsemen and call upon their own side. As soon as they recognized the 2 men, and saw through Litaficus's deceit, the Aedui began to hold out their hands in signal surrender, throwing away their weapons and pleading for their lives. Litaficus fled to Gugrovia with his dependents, for according to Gallic custom, it is a crime for them to abandon their lord, however desperate the circumstances. 41. Caesar sent envoys to the Aeduan people to instruct them that, as an act of generosity, he had preserved the lives of the men who he was entitled, according to the rules of war, to put to death. He gave over 3 hours of the night for his army to rest, then struck camp and advanced to Gugrovia. In the middle of their march, cavalry came from Fabius to report a perilous state of affairs. They explained that the camp had been besieged by a huge force. Fresh troops were constantly replacing the enemy soldiers when they grew weary. By forcing them to struggle without a rest, this enemy was exhausting our men, for the size of the camp necessitated the same troops manning the rampart continually. Many had been wounded by a hail of arrows and missiles of all kinds. Our artillery machines had proved extremely useful in withstanding these attacks. Now the enemy had withdrawn. Fabius was keeping 2 gates and blocking up all the others, and setting up barriers on the ramparts to make ready for a similar happening the next day. On hearing this news, with the enthusiastic support of the soldiers, Caesar reached the camp before sunrise. 42. While these events were taking place near Gergovia, the Aedui received the first messengers from Litaficus. They gave themselves no time to confirm his story. Some acted out of greed, others from motives of rancor or hasty imprudence, which are particularly characteristic of that people, and treated an unsubstantiated report as proven fact. They seized the property of Roman citizens and started to massacre and enslave them. Their situation was tottering already, but Convictolitavis sent it tumbling headlong, whipping the ordinary people into a passion, so that once their crimes were committed, they would be too afraid to come to their senses. By offering him a safe conduct, they persuaded a military tribune traveling to join his legion, one Marcus Aristeus, to leave the town of Cabellonum. They also forced the men who had settled there to trade to do likewise, suddenly attacking them while they journeyed. The Gauls stripped them of all their baggage. When Aristeus and the rest fought back, they hounded them for a day and night. After many were killed on both sides, they called to arms an even larger force. 43. While this was going on, the news came that all their soldiers were in Caesar's power. They ran to Aristeus and explained that nothing that had taken place was a matter of public policy. They also ordered an inquiry into the stolen property and confiscated property of Ludovicus and his brothers. Then they sent envoys to Caesar to clear themselves. All these measures they took to recover their own men, but they were besmirched by their crimes, enticed by the profits to be made from stolen goods, while the number of people involved in what had taken place was large. Alarmed by the thought of being punished, they began to enter secret negotiations for war, and sent embassies to sound out the other Gallic states. Although Caesar was aware of this, he still addressed the envoys as kindly as he could. He did not think any the worse of their state because of the ignorant folly of the common people, nor was his goodwill towards the Aedui diminished. In fact, he expected a fairly serious Gallic uprising. To avoid being surrounded by all the Gallic peoples, he decided on a strategy of withdrawal from Gergovia. This was to gather his entire army together, without the departure, which was actually prompted by anxiety about revolt, looking like headlong flight. 44. As he considered these matters, a chance for a successful action seemed to present itself. He had gone to the smaller camp to inspect the works, and noticed that a hill under enemy control, and in previous days scarcely visible for the numbers of men on it, was now unoccupied. Puzzled, he asked some deserters, a large number of whom were flocking to him daily, why this was. They all confirmed what Caesar himself had already learned through scouts, that there was a crest along the ridge of the high ground, which was almost level, but narrow and wooded at the point where it gave access onto the farther part of the town. The Gauls said the deserters were much afraid for this place, and were now convinced that once the Romans had one hill under control, if another high point were lost, it would be apparent that they were almost encircled and prevented either from escaping or from foraging for food. Vercingetorix had summoned all his men to fortify this crest along the ridge. 45. On learning this, Caesar sent a number of cavalry squadrons to the place around midnight, and ordered them to cause rather more disruption than usual as they ranged in every direction. At first light, he commanded a large number of pack horses and mules to be led out of camp, and had the coverings which stopped their loads chafing removed. The muleteers were told to put on helmets, to look and act like cavalry, and ride around the hills. To maintain this deception, he included a few cavalry who were to range more widely. He ordered them all to head for the same place by a long route. All these activities were watched from far off in the town, for there was a good view from Gergovia into the camp. But at such long range it was impossible to find out anything for sure. Caesar sent one of his legions to the same high ground as the cavalry, and when it had advanced a short way, he halted it on the lower ground and kept it concealed in the woods. Gallic suspicion grew, and their whole force transferred to the place to secure it. Caesar saw the enemy camp was unoccupied, so he had his men cover up their emblems and conceal their standards. Then he took the soldiers from the main camp to the smaller one in small groups, so as not to attract attention from the town. He explained to his legates, to each of whom he had given command of a legion, what he wanted done. In particular, he warned them to keep their soldiers under control and prevent them advancing too far in an eagerness to fight or in hope of booty. He also set out the disadvantage of their less favorable position, which he said only speed could alter. This was a moment for seizing an opportunity, not fighting a full-scale battle. After this briefing, he gave the signal, and at the same time sent the Aedui by another ascent on the right. 46. In a straight line, the wall of the town would be just over a mile from the level where the ascent began, but for the way it curved from side to side along its length. The more the route was made to wind to effect a gentler ascent, the more the distance of the march increased. About halfway up the hill, the Gauls had constructed a 6-foot wall of large stones, which ran lengthways following the contour line, to slow down our attack. They had left all the ground below this unoccupied, and filled the upper slopes as far as the town walls with camps packed closely together. When the signal was given, our soldiers quickly reached this line of defense, crossed it, and captured 3 enemy camps. In fact, they acted so quickly in seizing them that Teutomatus, the king of the Nitobridges, was taken by surprise in his tent whilst enjoying an afternoon nap, and just managed to tear himself from the hands of the plundering soldiers and escape half naked on a wounded horse. 47. Caesar achieved what he intended. He ordered the retreat to be sounded. The 10th Legion, which he was accompanying, halted at once. The soldiers of the other legions did not hear the trumpet blowing because a rather wide gully was between them, but they were held in check by the military tribunes and legates as Caesar had ordered. But the men were excited by the hope of a quick victory in the enemy's flight, and the successful outcome of previous battles, and they believed that there was nothing too difficult for their courage to achieve. So they did not abandon their pursuit until they drew close to the wall and gates of the town. At that moment a shout went up all over Gergovia. Those inside the most distant part of the town were panicked by the sudden uproar and thought that the Romans were already inside the gates. So they rushed out of the town. The married women began to throw clothing and money from the wall. Baring their breasts and leaning forward with outstretched arms, they pleaded with the Romans not to kill them, not to act as they had at Avaricum, when they did not even spare the lives of the women and children. It became apparent that a centurion of the 8th Legion, one Lucius Fabius, had declared among his men that he was stirred by the prospects of rewards such as the ones offered at Avaricum. He refused to let anyone else scale the wall before him. He grabbed 3 of his fellow soldiers, got them to hoist him up, and climb the wall. Then he in turn grasped hold of each of them and hauled them up on the wall. 48. In the meantime, the Gauls, who had assembled in another part of the town to fortify it, as we mentioned above, first of all heard the shouting, then were aroused by a flood of reports that the town was captured by the Romans. They sent cavalry on ahead, and then with a great charge sped off in the same direction. Wherever each man arrived first, there he stood beneath the wall and swelled the fighting strength of his compatriots. A large host gathered. Then the married women, who had just now been holding their hands out to the Romans, started to call upon their men and, in Gallic fashion, to unbind their hair and bring their children forward into view. For the Romans it was an unfair contest in terms of both ground and numbers. They were tired by their climb and the duration of the fighting, and found it difficult to withstand men who were fresh and unscathed. 49. When Caesar observed that they were fighting in a disadvantageous position, and that the enemy's numbers were growing, he became anxious for his men and sent to his legate, Titus Sextius, whom he had left in charge of the smaller camp. He told him to bring cohorts from the camp quickly and to station them at the foot of the hill on the enemy's right flank. In this way, if he saw that our men were driven from their positions, he would be able to deter the enemy from pursuing them unchallenged. Then he advanced a short distance with the 10th from the place where he had halted and awaited the outcome of the battle. 50. The fighting was now fierce, and at close quarters the enemy relied on their position and numbers, our men on their courage. Suddenly our men caught sight of the Aedui on our exposed flank. Although Caesar had sent them off to their right by another ascent to draw off the enemy, their weapons resembled those of the enemy so closely that our men panicked. Even though they could see the Aedui's right shoulders were bared, this was the agreed sign which regularly distinguished them. The soldiers believed that this was actually a ruse of the enemies designed to deceive them. At this moment the centurion Lucius Fabius and the men who had climbed the wall with him were surrounded and killed, then thrown headlong from the wall. Another centurion from the same legion, Marcus Petronius, had tried to break down the gates, but he was overwhelmed by the enemy host and abandoned hope of saving himself. Gravely wounded, he called to his soldiers who had followed him, "Since I cannot save myself along with you, I shall at least take care to secure your survival, for it was my desire for glory which made me lead you into danger. When I give you your chance, watch out for your own safety." At once he plunged into the middle of the enemy, killing 2 and forcing the rest a little way back from the gate. His men tried to come to his assistance, but he told them, "Your efforts to preserve my life are futile. Already my blood and my strength are draining away. So get away while you can, and make your way back to the legion." In this manner, he soon afterwards fell fighting, and proved the savior of his men. 51. Our men were overwhelmed on every side, and were forced back from the position with the loss of 46 centurions. But the 10th Legion, which had taken up a support position on rather more even ground, slowed down the Gauls' uncontrolled pursuit. The cohorts of the 13th Legion, which had been brought from the smaller camp by the legate Titus Sextius and had taken up positions on higher ground, once more took over from the 10th. As soon as the legions reached level ground, they halted and turned their standards to face the enemy. From the foot of the hill, Vercingetorix led his men back inside the fortifications. On that day, almost 700 soldiers were lost. The following day, Caesar called an assembly and upbraided the soldiers for their imprudence and over-eagerness, and deciding for themselves where to advance and what action to undertake, and for not halting when the signal for retreat was given. Also because they could not be restrained by the military tribunes and legates. He explained the significance of disadvantageous ground and what had motivated him at Avaricum, namely, that even though the enemy were caught without their leader or their cavalry, he had given up the chance of certain victory so as to avoid even small losses in action because of unfair ground. However admirable their courage, which neither the work of fortifying their camp, nor the height of the hill, nor the wall of the town had been able to check, nevertheless they deserved reproach for their lack of discipline and their presumption in thinking that they knew more about victory and outcomes than their commander did. He was as eager to find level-headedness and restraint in his soldiers as courage and daring. 53. Caesar finished his speech by encouraging the soldiers not to be disturbed because of these events, and not to attribute what had resulted from unfair ground to bravery on the enemy's part. At the end of the assembly, although he was still considering a departure in much the same terms as before, he led the legions out of camp and halted them in battle order on suitable ground. Vercingetorix did come down onto this level ground, but following a successful cavalry skirmish, Caesar led his army back to camp. After doing likewise on the following day, Caesar judged that enough had been done to minimize the Gauls' boasting and to improve his own soldiers' morale. So he struck camp and moved out to the Aedui. Not even then did the enemy pursue. On the third day he reached the river Allier, rebuilt the bridges, and took his army across. 54. On the other side he was greeted by Epidorix and Viridomarus, and learned that Litaviccus had set out with all his cavalry to rouse the Aedui. It was imperative, therefore, that the two of them should reach the Aeduan people first and reaffirm their loyalty. Caesar already had abundant proofs of Aeduan treachery, and he reckoned that the departure of Epidorix and Viridomarus was merely speeding up the revolt of that state. Even so, it seemed unwise to detain them, for fear of seeming to insult them, or giving the impression that he had something to fear. As they set out, he gave a short account of his services to the Aedui. He recalled the subservient position in which he had found them, driven into the towns, deprived of their land, all their supplies stolen, forced to pay tribute, hostages wrested from them in humiliating circumstances. And he recounted, too, the good fortune and considerable prosperity to which he had brought them, such that they had not only regained their previous distinction, but seemed even to have outdone all previous ages in prestige and influence. With this warning, he dismissed the Aedui from his presence. 55. Noviodunum was an Aeduan town in a favorable location on the banks of the Loire, to which Caesar had conveyed all his Gallic hostages, his corn, his funds, and most of his own baggage, and that of the army. He had also sent there a large number of horses bought for this war in Italy and Spain. When Epidorix and Viridomarus reached Noviodunum, they learned of the situation prevailing in their state. The Litaviccus had been received by the Aedui at Bibracte, which is their most important town, while their magistrate Convicto Litivus and a large part of the Senate had met with him. An official embassy had been sent to Vercingetorix to obtain peace and a friendly alliance. The two of them thought this advantageous position too good to throw away, so they killed the soldiers on guard at Noviodunum and the men who had come there to trade, and shared the money and horses out among themselves. They had the Gallic hostages sent to the magistrate at Bibracta. Judging that they would not be able to hold the town, they set it on fire to prevent the Romans making use of it. All the corn which they could manage at short notice they carried away by boat, and the rest they ruined by drenching or burning it. Then they began to muster a force from the neighboring territories, stationed guards along the Loire, and displayed their cavalry conspicuously everywhere to cause panic. Their intention was to cut the Romans off from their corn supply, or to starve them out of the province. The fact that the Loire was swollen with meltwater greatly strengthened their hopes, for it seemed altogether impossible to ford the river. 56. When Caesar learned all of this, he decided that if he was going to run the risk of rebuilding the bridges, he had to hurry, so that he could fight an engagement before larger forces gathered at the river. As for changing his plan and marching to the province, he thought that not even fear made it necessary, nor was there only the shame and disgrace of such a course, and the obstacle of the Cevennes, and the problem of the route to stand in the way. There was also, and most importantly, the fact of his concern for Labienus and the legions he had sent with him, both now cut off. So it was that he completed long forced marches by day and night to surprise everyone by reaching the Loire. The cavalry found a fording place which was serviceable in an emergency. The men were able to keep their arms and shoulders clear of the water and hold up their weapons. Cavalry was posted to break up the force of the current. On first sighting them, the enemy were thrown into such confusion that Caesar got the army across in safety. In the fields he found a plentiful supply of corn and cattle, and once the army had sufficient stocks of both, he began to march to the land of the Senones. Hmm. 57. While Caesar was thus occupied, Labienus left the supplementary levy, which had just arrived from Italy, to guard the baggage, and set out with 4 legions for Lucia. This is a town of the Parisii, sited on an island in the river Seine. When the enemy learned of his coming, a large force from the neighboring states gathered. The supreme command was entrusted to an Illyrican, Camulogenus. Despite his relatively advanced age, he was singled out for this distinction because of his outstanding knowledge of military matters. When he observed a continuous expanse of marsh which flowed into the Seine and formed a significant obstruction over the whole area, he encamped there and made ready to prevent our men from crossing. 58. Labienus's first move was to fetch the movable shelters and to cover the surface of the marsh with wicker hurdles and rubble. Once he saw that this was too difficult, he moved silently out of camp during the 3rd watch and reached Mediosedum on the same route by which he had come. Mediosedum is a town of the Senones on an island in the Seine, like Lucia, which we mentioned just now. He seized about 50 ships and quickly joined them together into a bridge, then sent his soldiers across on it. Most of the townspeople had been called up for the war. They were so panic-stricken by this unprecedented action that Labienus won control of the town without a struggle. He repaired the bridge which the enemy had earlier broken up, then took his army across and began to march downstream towards Lucia. When refugees from Mediosedum told the enemy what had happened, the Gauls gave order for Lucia to be burned and its bridges broken up. They advanced from the marsh to the banks of the Seine and took up position opposite Lucia, facing Labienus's camp. 59. By now, news had come of Caesar's departure from Gergovia, and rumors of the Aedui treachery and the success of the Gallic uprising were reported. The Gauls began to declare to one another at their meetings that Caesar's march and his way over the Loire had been blocked off, and that he had been forced to make for the province. But when the news of the Aedui's treachery broke, the Bellovaci, who were already disloyal themselves, began to muster a force and openly make ready for war. Because of this total change of circumstances, Labienus realized that he must adopt a very different strategy from the one he had intended. He must think no longer of ways to make acquisitions or inflict injury on the enemy in battle, but rather of how to bring his army safely back to Agrigentum. On one side threatened the Bellovaci, a nation with a reputation for outstanding bravery in Gaul. Camulogenus held the other, with an army drawn up at the ready. A great river cut the legions off from their baggage and its guards. In the face of these extreme difficulties, Labienus saw that they must look to courage to help them. 60. At dusk he called a council and urged his men to carry out his orders promptly and to the letter. He assigned each of the ships which he had taken from Mediacedum to a Roman knight, and ordered them to advance 4 miles downstream in silence, starting at the end of the first watch, and to await him there. To guard the camp he left the 5 cohorts which he thought were the least determined fighters. The remaining 5 from the same legion he ordered to set out upstream at midnight with all their baggage, and to make a great uproar about it. He acquired some small boats and sent them to row upstream too, amid much loud splashing. Soon afterwards he himself set out in silence with 3 legions and made for the location where he had told the ships to put in. 61. At the time when he arrived, a fierce storm had suddenly arisen, so that the enemy's scouts who were posted all along the river were caught unawares by our men. Under the control of the Roman knights who had charge of this task, the army and the cavalry were swiftly got across. At almost the same moment, just before dawn, the enemy were told that there was an unusual uproar in the Roman camp. A large column was marching upstream. The sound of oars could be heard coming from the same direction, and a short way downstream soldiers were being ferried across in boats. On hearing all this, the enemy thought that the legions were crossing the river in 3 places and getting ready to escape because they were so disturbed by the treachery of the Agii, so they divided their force into 3. They left the garrison opposite the camp and sent a small force towards Mediacedum to advance as far as the ships had done, then led the remainder of their troops against Labienus. 62. By the first light all our men had crossed and the enemy battle line was in view. Labienus urged the soldiers to be mindful of their former courage and their previous successful engagements, and to imagine that Caesar himself, under whose leadership they had so often overcome their foes, was actually present. Then he gave the signal for battle. At the first clash, on the right wing, where the 7th Legion was positioned, the enemy was driven back and routed. On the left, the position held by the 12th Legion, the enemy's leading ranks were pierced by weapons and fell, but the survivors still fought fiercely, and no one gave any sign of intending to run away. The enemy leader, Camulogenus, was present among his men, urging them on. Even now the outcome was in doubt, but when the tribunes of the 7th received a report of what was happening on the left wing, they brought the legion round behind the enemy and attacked. Not even then did anyone desert. They were all surrounded and killed. Camulogenus suffered a similar fate. When the troops who had been left facing Labienus's camp to watch it heard the battle underway, they went to the assistance of their comrades and occupied a hill. They were, however, unable to withstand the onslaught of our victorious soldiers. They intermingled with their compatriots in flight, and all who failed to reach the protection of the woods and mountains were put to death by the cavalry. Labienus had made an end of the business. He now returned to Agrigentum, where the whole army's baggage had been left. On the 3rd day he set out from Agrigentum with his entire force and made his way to Caesar. 63. The news of the Agii's defection extended hostilities. Embassies were sent in every direction, and they did all they could, through favors, influence, and bribery, to win the support of the Gallic peoples. They seized the hostages Caesar had left in their charge. By threatening to punish these hostages, they terrified waverers into compliance. The Agii asked Vercingetorix to come to them and explain his campaign strategies, but when this was agreed, they argued that he should hand supreme command to them. Now that the matter was in dispute, an assembly of the whole of Gaul was announced to be held at Brabacta. The Gauls flocked there in hordes from every quarter. When the question was put to a popular vote, the result was that Vercingetorix was unanimously approved as sole commander. Absent from this assembly were the Remi, Lingones, and Treveri. The first two of these nations still held to their friendship with the Romans, but because the Treveri lived too far away and were presently under German attack, they played no part at all in the campaign and did not support either side. The Aedui took being ousted from their supreme control very badly, bewailing their change of fortunes, and began to miss the favor Caesar had shown towards them. Nevertheless, they did not dare part company with the rest of the Gauls now that the campaign had started. With reluctance, the two young men of ambition, Epidaurus and Viridomarus, bowed to Vercingetorix. Getting exciting. 64. Vercingetorix demanded that the other states surrender hostages and named the day for this to be effected. He ordered all the cavalry, 15,000 in total, to assemble with haste. He also stated that he would be content with the infantry force he had before. After all, he was not going to try his luck or fight in a pitched battle, since he had cavalry in plenty. It would be easy to cut the Romans off from both regular corn supplies and forage, but the Gauls must agree to destroy their own stocks of corn and to set their buildings on fire. They must understand that the loss of their property would enable them to achieve perpetual supremacy and liberty. Once these matters were arranged, he demanded 10,000 soldiers from the Aedui and Segusiavi, who lived alongside the province, in addition 800 cavalry. In charge of them he put Epidaurus' brother, and told him to attack the Allobroges. In another direction he sent the Gabali and the nearest Avernian communities against the Helvi, and also sent the Rutini and Cadorisi to ravage the territory of the Volcae Aricomi. Despite this, in the hopes that their minds were still unsettled after the recent war, he sent messengers and embassies in secret to persuade the Allobroges to join him. To their leaders he promised money, and to the state as a whole supreme command over the whole of the province. 65. In preparation for all these contingencies, a defense force of 22 cohorts mustered in the province itself by the legate Julius Caesar had been provided. These cohorts were posted throughout the area, acting on their own initiative. The Helvi joined battle with their neighbors, but were routed. After the death of the leader of their state, one Gaius Valerius Donatorus, son of Cabarus, together with a number of other men, they were forced back behind the walls of their towns. The Allobroges stationed garrisons at frequent intervals along the Rhone, and kept a close and careful watch on their borders. Caesar was aware that the enemy was the stronger in cavalry, and that because all routes were cut off, there was no hope of reinforcements from Italy and the province. For this reason, he sent across the Rhine into Germany to the peoples which he had subdued in the previous years, and demanded from them cavalry and light armed troops to fight in amongst the horses. When they arrived, the horses they were using were hardly suitable, so Caesar took the horses of his military tribune and the rest of the Roman knights and veterans and distributed them among the Germans. 66. While all this was taking place, the enemy force from the Averni and the cavalry which had been requisitioned from the whole of Gaul were gathering. Caesar was marching to the Sequani over the outer limits of Ligone's territory, so that he could more easily bring help to the province. At the same time, once Vercingetorix had mustered a large host of these contingents, he marched for 3 days and then halted about 9 miles away from the Romans, arranging his force in 3 camps. He summoned his cavalry commanders to a meeting and explained that the moment for victory had arrived. The fact that the Romans were running away to the province and leaving Gaul, he went on, was enough to win them temporary liberty, but it was insufficient to secure peace and tranquility permanently. The Romans would surely gather a larger force and return to prolong the war indefinitely. For this reason they must attack while the Romans were marching in column, and hence encumbered by baggage. If the soldiers went to help their comrades and were delayed for that purpose, they could not continue the march. If, on the other hand, the Roman soldiers abandoned their baggage and thought only of their own safety, and he was sure this was the more likely response, they would at a stroke be stripped of their essential equipment and of their dignity. He went on to assure his cavalry commanders that they could be sure not one of the enemy horsemen would dare to advance even a short distance away from the main column. To encourage them to act bravely, he would parade his entire force in front of the camp and strike fear into the enemy. The cavalry cried that they must be bound by a solemn oath. No man was to be received beneath a roof or have access to his children, his parents, or his wife unless he had twice ridden through the enemy column. 67. This action was approved, and everyone took the oath. The next day the cavalry was divided into 3 contingents. 2 adopted battle formation and appeared on either side of the column, while the third to impede the march from the front. On hearing the news of this, Caesar ordered his own cavalry to divide into 3 likewise, and to attack the enemy. There was fighting everywhere at once. The column halted, and the legions withdrew the baggage into their midst. If it appeared that our men were in difficulties or hard-pressed in any area, Caesar gave orders for standards to advance in the line of battle to form up. This action slowed the enemy pursuit as well as encouraging our men with the hope of assistance. After some time, the Germans on the right flank seized a ridge of high ground. Forcing the enemy down, they routed them, pursued them right down to the river, where Vercingetorix and his infantry had taken up position, and killed a number of them. After observing this, the rest were afraid of being surrounded, and so fled. There was slaughter everywhere. 3 aristocratic Aeduans were captured and taken to Caesar. The cavalry commander Cotus, who had been locked in rivalry with Convicto Litivus at the previous elections, Cavalus, who had been put in charge of the infantry after the desertion of Litivicus, and Epidorix, under whose leadership the Aedui had campaigned against the Sequani before the coming of Caesar. Now all his cavalry had fled. Vercingetorix withdrew his infantry force, which he had stationed in front of the 3 camps, and immediately began the march to Alesia, which is a town of the Mandubi. He issued orders for the baggage to be fetched quickly from the camps and to follow on behind. Caesar had his army's baggage taken to the nearest high ground and left 2 legions behind to guard it. He pursued Vercingetorix as long as the light lasted and killed about 3,000 of the enemy rear guard. The following day he pitched camp near Alesia. He reconnoitered the city's position and provoked panic in the enemy. Then, after encouraging the soldiers for the task he set about the work of circumvallation. The actual stronghold of Alesia was in the extremely lofty position on top of the hill, apparently impregnable except by means of a siege. On 2 sides, the foot of this hill was washed by rivers, and for about 3 miles there stretched a plain in front of the town. Close by in every other direction, more hills of equal height girded the town. Beneath the wall, where the hill faced east, the Gallic forces filled the entire space. They had constructed a ditch and a 6-foot wall. The length of the siege works which the Romans had started reached 10 miles. Camps had been pitched at suitable locations, and 23 forts built along the line. 3 forts were garrisoned in the daytime to guard against unsuspected sorties. At night, sentries and reinforced patrols kept watch there. 70. After work on the siege had begun, a cavalry battle took place in the 3-mile stretch of plain which we mentioned above as lying between the hills. Both sides fought fiercely. When our men got into difficulties, Caesar sent the Germans to their assistance and stationed the legions in front of the camps to prevent any sudden invasion by the enemy infantry. Now that they had the protection of the legions, our cavalry's courage rose. The enemy were routed. There were so many of them that they got in one another's way as they fled. They were crushed together in a heap at the gates, which they had left too narrow. The Germans pursued them eagerly, right up to their ditch and wall. Massive slaughter ensued as some of the Gauls abandoned their horses and tried to cross the ditch and climb over the wall. Caesar ordered the legions he had stationed just outside the camp ramparts to advance a short way. The Gauls inside the fortifications were equally terrified and sounded the call to arms in the belief that an assault was imminent. Some were in such a panic that they forced their way into the town. Vercingetorix ordered the closing of the gates to stop the camp being completely deserted. After killing many and capturing a number of horses, the Germans withdrew. 71. Vercingetorix now decided to send all his cavalry away by night before the Romans completed their siege works. As they left, he told each of them to go to his own people and muster for battle all men of an age to bear arms. He described the services he had done them, and called upon them to take thought for his safety, and not to abandon him to the enemy's torments after he had done so much to secure the liberty of all. Finally, he reminded them any hint of negligence in them would bring about the deaths of 80,000 picked men, as well as his own. Once the plan was adopted, Vercingetorix had barely enough corn for 30 days, though by practicing economy it could be made to last a little longer. Once his orders were issued, during the second watch he sent the cavalry away noiselessly through a gap in our siege works. He demanded that all corn be sent to him, and decreed the death penalty for those who disobeyed. There was an abundance of livestock which had been wrested from the Mandubi, and this he shared out among individuals. He arranged for corn to be shared out gradually and sparingly, and withdrew all the forces which he had posted in front of the town back inside. Now these arrangements were in place, he began to await reinforcements from Gaul and prepared to conduct his campaign. 72. All these arrangements were relayed to Caesar by deserters and prisoners. He then decided to set up the following type of fortification. He had a 20-foot wide ditch dug with vertical sides, so that the bottom of the ditch was as wide as its edges to the top. He fixed the position of all the other fortifications 400 paces back from the ditch, with the intention of preventing an unexpected or nighttime onslaught on them by the enemy army, and of stopping the enemy aiming missiles at our men while they were busy on the siege works. For the area he had enclosed was necessarily of considerable size, and it would be difficult to encircle the entire site with a cordon of soldiers. At this distance away, then, he extended 2 more ditches, of the same depth but 15 feet across. He filled the inner one, which was on a low-lying ground in the plain, with water diverted from the river. Behind them he constructed an earthwork with a rampart on top, 12 feet high. To this he attached a parapet and battlements, with large pointed stakes projecting at the joints where the parapet attached to the earthwork. This would slow down an enemy ascent. He placed towers all around the siege works at intervals of 80 feet. 73. Our forces were obliged to find timber and corn and to construct these extensive fortifications simultaneously. Because they regularly advanced considerable distances from the camp, their numbers were depleted as a result. Sometimes the Gauls would try to test our defensive works by making a sortie in strength from several of the town's gates. For this reason, Caesar deemed it necessary to add to the works to facilitate manning of the fortifications by a smaller number of soldiers. Tree trunks and thick branches were cut down, stripped of their bark and sharpened at the end. Ditches 5 feet deep were dug, and the stakes inserted into them, and fastened firmly at the bottom so that they could not be torn up. The branches were left projecting. There were 5 rows of stakes to a ditch, all joined and interlinking. Anyone who made his way into them would be impaled on the extremely sharp spikes. The men called them gravestones. In front of them, set out in the diagonal rows of a quincunx pattern, pits were dug 3 feet deep, sloping slightly inwards from the top to bottom. Smooth stakes as thick as a man's thigh and sharpened and tempered at the end were sunk into the pits. They projected no more than 3 inches above the ground. For strength and stability, earth was trodden in around them to a depth of 1 foot, and the rest of the pit was then covered with twigs and brushwood to camouflage the trap. 8 rows of such pits were dug at 3-foot intervals. From the resemblance to a flower, the men called these lilies. In front of them, logs were dug into the earth. Each of them was a foot long and covered with iron hooks. These were scattered everywhere, a little way apart. The men called them spurs. 74. Once these measures were completed, Caesar constructed similar fortifications following the flattest line that the terrain allowed. These encompassed a 14-mile circuit, facing the opposite direction against the enemy outside. These ensured that the garrisons on the defenses could not be overcome even by a great host should the occasion arise. To avoid being forced to take the risk of leaving camp, he ordered everyone to see the corn and forage for 30 days was gathered. Excuse me. 75. While this was going on at Alesia, the Gauls called a meeting of their leaders. They decided not to follow Vercingetorix's proposal that all men able to bear arms should be called up, but rather to levy a certain number from each state. This would prevent their creating so large and ill-assorted an army that it would be impossible to exercise control or pick out their own people or provide enough corn. From the Aedui and the dependents, the Segusiavi, Embluradi, Alarici, Branovices, and Blanovi, they demanded 35,000 and an equal number from the Averni, together with the Eleute, Caterici, Gabali, and Valavi. All of these peoples are usually under Avernian rule. From the Sequani, Senones, Biturices, Centoni, Rutini, and Carnutes, they demanded 12,000 each, and 10,000 each from Belovaci and Lemovices, 8,000 each from the Pictones, Teroni, Parisi, and Helveti, 5,000 each from the Siones, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Pedrocori, Nervi, Morini, and Nidiobriges. The same from the Alarici, Senomani, 4,000 from the Atrabates, 3,000 from Veliocasi, Laxovi, and Alarici Ebrovices, 2,000 from the Raurici and Boy, 30,000 in total from the maritime states which call themselves Aramoric, including the Kyriosolites, Redones, Ambibari, Caletes, Assasimi, Veneti, and Venelli. Of these states, the Bellovaci did not complete their quota, because they declared that they were going to fight the Romans independently and in their own name, and so would not bow to anyone else's command. At the request of Commius, however, they did send 2,000 men along with the rest for the sake of their friendship with him. 76. Caesar had enjoyed the loyalty and good offices of this Commius in Britain in previous years. In return for these services, Caesar had declared that his state was to be exempt from taxation. He had restored its rights and laws and made the Morini pay it tribute. In spite of this, the whole of Gaul was united in the desire of restoring liberty and their former reputation for warfare to such an extent that neither services rendered nor remembrance of friendship moved them, and they all concentrated all their efforts of will and resources on the war. Once 8,000 cavalry and about 240,000 infantry were mustered, a review and reckoning of numbers was held in Aeduan territory. Then officers were assigned. The chief commands went to Commius the Atribation, the Aeduans Verodomarus and Epidaurus, and the Avernian Vercassivellaunus, who was a cousin of Vercingetorix. Subordinates from the Gallic states were assigned to them to advise on the conduct of the campaign. They all set out for Alesia, eager and full of confidence. Not a single one of them believed it would be possible to withstand even the sight of such a mighty host, especially as the battle would be fought on two fronts. For at the moment when this vast army of horse and foot came into view from outside, there was to be a sortie from the town. 77. As for those who were trapped inside Alesia, the day when they had expected the reinforcements to arrive was past. Their corn was all gone, and they knew nothing of what was happening among the Aedui. So they called a meeting to debate the outcome of their situation. Various opinions were declared, some advising surrender, others urging a sortie while they still had the strength for it. The speech of Critognatus, vile and remarkable for its cruelty, should not be passed over here. Critognatus was an Avernian noble of noble birth, and considered to be a man of great influence. Not one word shall I speak, he said, concerning the opinion of those men who call shameful slavery by the name of surrender, nor do I think they should be treated as citizens of Gaul, or called to our assemblies. My concern is with those who are proposing a sortie. For this advice of theirs seems through your support for it to preserve some remembrance of former courage. Yet it is not courage, but a weak spirit, which is unable to endure such trifling hardship. It is easier to find men ready and willing to face death than men prepared to endure suffering with forbearance. Even so, I might have approved their advice, such is the force of their prestige, if I expected no loss from it beyond our lives. Yet we must look to the whole of Gaul in forming our plans, for it is the whole of Gaul that we have summoned to our assistance. If 80,000 men are killed in this one place, what do you think the state of mind of our relations and kinsmen will be when they are forced to give battle practically on top of the corpses? Do not rob them of your help when they have ignored the danger threatening them to save you, and do not bring the whole of Gaul to ruin or commit it to endless slavery because of your reckless lack of judgment or weakness of purpose. Or do you doubt their loyalty and determination because they have not arrived on the exact day? What then? Do you think that the Romans are hard at work on those outer defenses every day for their own amusement? If you cannot find encouragement from their messengers because every approach is blockaded, let the Romans be your witnesses that they are drawing near, for it is fear of that event which keeps them busy day and night on the fortifications. So now, what do I advise? Do what our ancestors did in the war, a much less important one, with the Cimbri and Teutoni. When they were forced into the towns under the strain of a deprivation like our own, they sustained their existence on the bodies of those who were too old to be of use in the campaign, and as a result, they did avoid surrendering to their enemies. Even if we had no precedent for such a practice, I would still judge it a fine policy to establish for the sake of liberty and to hand down to our descendants. After all, what resemblance was there between that war and the present one? Certainly, once Gaul was devastated and destruction widespread, the Cimbri did finally depart from our land and go in search of other territories. They left us our own laws and rights, our lands and liberty. In contrast, what do the Romans seek? What do they desire, if not to follow envy's prompting? To become established in the lands and states of people whose distinguished reputation and military strength they acknowledge, and to inflict perpetual slavery upon them. Never have they waged a war on terms other than those. But if you are ignorant of what happens among far-off peoples, look at the part of Gaul which borders our land, reduced to the status of a province. Its rights and laws changed. Subjected to Roman dominion, it is oppressed by perpetual slavery. '78. After everyone's opinions were expressed, they decided that all those whose age or infirmity made them useless in the war should leave the town, and resolved to try every course of action before resorting to Critognatus's proposal. But if circumstances were pressing and the reinforcements were delayed, then that was the time to put his advice into practice, rather than submitting to terms of peace and surrender. The Mandubi, who had received them into the town, were forced to take their wives and children and depart from it. When they came to the Roman fortifications in tears, they begged and pleaded to be accepted as slaves and given food. Caesar, however, set guards on the ramparts and refused to admit them. 79. Meanwhile, Commius and the other leaders, entrusted with the supreme command, reached Alesia. with all their forces. They occupied a hill outside less than a mile from our fortifications and took up positions there. The next day they brought their cavalry out of camp and filled the whole of the plain, which we described earlier as being 3 miles across. They withdrew their infantry force a short distance and halted it on high ground. From the town of Alesia there was a clear view on to the plain. Once the reinforcements were sighted, the besieged inhabitants hurried together and began to congratulate one another. Everyone was stirred to a state of rejoicing, so they led the army out and took up position in front of the camp. They covered the nearest trench with wicker hurdles and filled it in with earth, then made ready for a sortie in any eventuality. 80. Caesar arranged his entire army along the 2 lines of defense so that, if the occasion arose, each man would know his own station and stick to it. Then he ordered the cavalry to be led out of camp and engaged in battle. There was a clear view from the camps located all around the top of the ridge, so every soldier was watching intently for the outcome. The Gauls had interspersed a few archers and light-armed skirmishers among their horsemen to offer assistance, if their own side gave ground, and to resist the charge of our cavalry. A number of our soldiers were unexpectedly wounded by these men and began to leave the fighting. The Gauls were now convinced that their men were the better fighters and could see that ours were hard-pressed by their weight of numbers. From all directions, shouting and howling went up from the Gauls within the defenses and from those who had come to their aid, strengthening the resolve of their men. The action took place in full view of all, and it was impossible for any deed, be it courageous or cowardly, to be concealed. Thus the desire for praise and the fear of failure roused both sides to acts of bravery. The fighting continued without a definite outcome from midday almost until sunset. Then, in one part of the battle, Germans massed their squadrons, charged the enemy, and routed them. Once the Gallic cavalry was put to flight, the archers were surrounded and killed. Likewise, elsewhere, our men pursued the Gallic fugitives right up to their camp, giving them no chance to reform. Those who had advanced from Alesia almost gave up hope of victory and returned to the town in dejection. 81. A day went by during which time the Gauls manufactured a large quantity of wicker hurdles, ladders, and grappling hooks. At dead of night, they quietly left their camp and approached the lines of defense in the plain. Suddenly a cry went up, which signaled their arrival to those who were besieged in the town. Then the Gauls began to throw down the hurdles and use slings, arrows, and stones to dislodge our men from the rampart, and they got ready everything they needed for an attack. At the moment when the shout was heard, Vercingetorix had the trumpet sound, the signal to his men, and led them out of the town. Our men took up the positions which they had previously been assigned on the defenses, and by the use of slings, firing large stones, stakes earlier set out along the defenses, and missiles, they frightened off the Gauls. Darkness decreased visibility, with the result that both sides incurred many casualties. The artillery machines kept up a hail of missiles. The defense of these sectors had been allotted to the legates Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius. They took men from the towers further away and sent them to assist as reinforcements, where they realized that our men were under pressure. 82. While the Gauls were some distance from the defenses, they had the advantage in number of missiles, but when they came up closer, they were impaled on the spurs or fell into the pits and were transfixed, or they were killed by pikes thrown from the rampart and towers. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but there was no breach in the defenses. As dawn approached, therefore, the Gauls were afraid of encirclement on their exposed flank from the Roman camp higher up, and retreated to their comrades. While this was happening, those inside the town fetched out the equipment Vercingetorix had made ready for a sortie and filled in the first set of trenches. But they took too long over their arrangements, and before they reached the defenses, learned that their comrades had withdrawn. So they returned to the town without accomplishing their purpose. 83. The Gauls had now suffered serious setbacks on 2 occasions, and began to discuss what to do. They summoned men who knew the area well, and from them found out about the site and defenses the Roman camp on the higher ground. There was a hill to the north which our men had been unable to include in the siege works because of its large circumference. They had been obliged to set up the camp on the ground which, because of a gradual slope, was slightly disadvantageous. In charge of it were the legates Gaius Antistius Reginus and Gaius Caninius Rebilius, with 2 legions. Once their scouts had reconnoitered the area, the Gallic leaders chose 60,000 of their men from the states which had the greatest reputation for courage. They decided among themselves in secret what must be done, and in what manner, then fixed the time for the attack at midday. Almost there. In charge of this force was an Avernian called Vercassivellaunus. He was one of the 4 Gallic leaders and a kinsman of Vercingetorix. During the first watch he left camp. After nearly completing his march by daybreak, he concealed himself beyond the mountain and ordered his soldiers to rest and recover from their efforts of the previous night. When noon drew near, he set out against the camp we described above. At the same time, the cavalry began to ride up to the defenses in the plain, and the rest of the force appeared in the front of the camp. 84. Vercingetorix saw his men from the citadel of Alesia and marched out of the town, taking the wicker hurdles, poles, shelters, siege hooks, and the rest of the equipment he had made ready for the sortie. At one and the same moment there was fighting on every side, and every expedient was put to the test. Wherever a hint of weakness appeared, there they flocked to the attack. The Roman force was strung out along its extensive fortifications and found rallying to the defenses difficult in many places. The shouting which arose behind them was effective in frightening our men as they fought, for they realized that the risk to themselves depended on the courage shown by others. After all, it is usually the case that what is unseen is more effective in disturbing men's minds. 85. Caesar took over a suitable spot and found out what was happening in every quarter. He sent help to those who were in difficulties. Both sides realized that this was the very moment for putting their utmost effort into the fight. The Gauls must despair of saving themselves until they broke through the Roman defenses. And the Romans, if they held firm, were looking forward to the end of all their labors. The struggle was hardest on the upper defenses, where, as we explained, Vercassivellaunus had been sent. The unfavorable downward slope of the site played a crucial part. Some of the enemy threw missiles, others formed a tortoise and moved up close. Exhausted troops were continually being replaced by fresh. They all threw earth onto the defenses, which gave the Gauls a means of ascent, as well as covering over the devices which the Romans had hidden in the ground. Our men were now running out of weapons and of strength. 86. When he realized what was happening, Caesar sent Labienus with 6 cohorts to help the men in trouble. He told him that if it was impossible to hold his ground, he should withdraw his forces and then launch a counterattack, but this was only to be done in an emergency. Caesar then approached the rest of the men in person and urged them not to give up the struggle. He explained the fruits of all their previous battles depended on that day, that hour. Inside the Roman lines, the enemy abandoned hope of success on the level ground because of the size of the defenses, so they tried to climb one of the steep ascents to take it, and had all the equipment they had prepared conveyed there. A hail of missiles from the defenders on the towers scattered them, but they filled in the ditches with earth and hurdles and started to tear down the rampart and parapet with grappling hooks. 87. Caesar sent first the young Brutus with some cohorts, then his legate Gaius Fabius with more. Finally, when the fighting grew more fierce, he came in person, leading fresh troops for reinforcements. The battle was renewed, and the enemy forced back. Then Caesar made for the place where he had sent Labienus. He withdrew 4 cohorts from the nearest fort and ordered one section of cavalry to follow him, the rest to move round the outer defenses and attack the enemy from the rear. Once Labienus had found that neither earthworks nor ditches could stand up to the enemy attack, he gathered 11 cohorts, which happened to be available after their withdrawal from the nearby guards posts. He then sent word to Caesar of what he thought needed to be done. Caesar hurried to join in the fighting. 88. The conspicuous color of the cloak he habitually wore in battle proclaimed his arrival. Because the downward slopes were in clear view from the heights above, the enemy spotted the cavalry squadrons and cohorts he had ordered to follow him and join battle. A shout went up from both sides and was answered by another from the rampart and defense works. Our men drew their spears, then fought with swords. Suddenly the cavalry was glimpsed in the rear. More cohorts were advancing. The enemy turned tail, and the cavalry charged them as they fled. Massive slaughter followed. Julius, the commander and leader of the Lemovices, was killed. The Vernian Vercassivellaunus was taken alive as he fled. 74 military standards were brought back to Caesar. Only a few of the vast enemy host made their way safely back to camp. Those in the town viewed the slaughter and the flight of their comrades. Abandoning hope, they withdrew their forces from the defenses. As soon as the news broke, the Gauls fled from their camp. If our men had not been exhausted after numerous relief efforts and all the struggles of the day, they would have been able to wipe out the entire enemy army. The cavalry was sent out at around midnight and caught up with the enemy rear guard. Many of the enemy were taken and killed. The rest fled to their home states. 89. The following day, Vercingetorix called a council and argued that he had undertaken this war not in his own interest, but for the liberty of all. Since they were forced to yield to fortune, he went on, he was putting himself in their hands, ready for either outcome, whether they wanted to make reparation to the Romans by putting him to death or to hand him over alive. They sent envoys to Caesar to discuss these options, and he ordered them to give up their weapons and bring out the ringleaders. Then he took his seat within the fortifications in front of his camps, and the ringleaders were brought to him there. Vercingetorix was handed over, and weapons were thrown down. Caesar had the Agii and Arverni kept back, in case he could use them to win back their state's allegiance, and the rest of the prisoners he shared out as booty, one apiece to his entire army. 90. Once this business was settled, he set out for the territory of the Agii and won back their nation. The Avernian envoys who had been sent there pledged to carry out whatever he told them to do. He demanded a large number of hostages. Then he sent the legions to winter quarters. He returned about 20,000 prisoners to the Agii and Arverni. He ordered Titus Labienus to take 2 legions and the cavalry and set out for the land of the Sequani, assigning to him Marcus Sempronius Rudilus. He posted his legates, Gaius Fabius and Lucius Minucius Basilis, with 2 legions among the Remi, to prevent any defeat from being inflicted by the neighboring Bellovaci. He sent Gaius Antistius Reginus to the Ambibarati, Titus Sextius to the Beturgias, and Gaius Caninius Rebellius to the Rutini, each with a single legion. He stationed Quintus Tullius Cicero and Publius Sulpicius at Cabellonum, and Metisco adjoined settlements near the Saone to arrange a supply of corn. He himself decided to winter in Bibracta. When dispatches arrived at Rome giving news of these events, a thanksgiving of 20 days was decreed. And that's the end of Book 7. So Book 8 is the last one. It's shorter, but we'll do that next time. I don't think I'm going to stream next Monday. It might end up being Sunday. But I will let everyone know that, what I decide. So, anyone who's still there, thanks for hanging. See you for the conclusion. Book 8. Hopefully I'll still be able to speak by then. Thanks, Ray. You're still there. Alright. See everyone later. Bye.